The United States is the highest incarcerator in the rich world, with almost 2 million people behind bars. Oklahoma ranks among the top states for incarceration rates. 1 in every 110 adults. This is over 34,000 people that are incarcerated. The Free wants to ask the question of the deep connection between mass incarceration and our economic system. And for this reason, there is no better guest than John Clegg, who wrote, "The indignities of punishment in capitalist societies are not the result of malicious actors, punitive cultures, poorly crafted institutions, or incompetent governments. They are problems of its basic structure." John, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. We had you on our live event on October 24th. And we're here with you today to really explore the economic dimension that is the foundation to understand the record high levels of the punitive state in the United States. And it's not just about what happens in the 70s and the 80s with the war on drugs that starts emerging, and of course in the 90s. But you are tracing it back much longer and looking at the dynamics between the political economy and the state and class power, right? And this is what I think is so interesting in showing how a Marxian framework can really give a much more insightful and thorough understanding of the whole process, the global issue in itself. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about how this historical approach is so illuminating by focusing on why the problem is not the 70s, the moment of the explosion of the crime rate, but what happens earlier that leads up to this.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's actually a way that I've changed my views as a result of this work. Because in the Catalyst article that you mentioned, we actually follow the kind of standard literature, which is to say, it looks like, if you just look at incarceration rates over time, it looks like the US used to be like other countries, used to have similar incarceration rates as other countries. And then something fundamentally changed in the 70s, such that we now have mass incarceration. And so most explanations of mass incarceration, are focused on that 70s period. They want to ask what happened. How did the US become different, from other countries? But in the work that I've done since with Adana and with many research assistants, I think we've worked with over 100 research assistants now in writing this book. What we've done is we've tried to kind of decompose the incarceration rate into its various elements, its various constituent elements. And then we tried to compare those constituent elements of the incarceration rate across time and space for virtually every country in the world. And so there's a kind of way in which we can compare all of those across time. And what we find is, in fact, the US has always been different in most of those dimensions. The US has always been exceptional, especially compared to other rich countries. So in the terms of crime, the US has always had a very high crime rate. Today, that's partly about guns, but it's not just about guns, and it certainly hasn't always been. It's largely about inequality, but also penal severity. So the US has always had much longer sentences, conditional on being convicted, and much harsher sentences, right? So the death penalty is one obvious example, but also a more higher likelihood of being given a custodial sentence versus a fine and these kinds of things, right? So the harshness of American justice is actually persistent across time. The crime rate, high crime rate, is also very persistent across time. So that raises the question, what changed in the 70s? And the puzzling thing, or the surprising thing to us, is that it turns out that while America had very harsh justice in the past and very high crime in the past, it actually had a low probability of being incarcerated prior to the 70s, conditional on committing a crime. So that we call that the low certainty of punishment. It actually turns out to be much cheaper to send people away to prison for long periods of time than to invest in the kind of modern, efficient police service that is going to sort of surveil the population. That's very expensive, right? And if you ask wealthy people, what they want, especially when it comes to its impact not just on their pocketbook but on their lives, they'll much prefer to have just throw away the poorest and marginalized people into prison than to accept a police service that could potentially police them, right? I mean, even the wealthy are to some extent affected by policing. They're not affected at all by how bad the prisons are because they never end up in prison, right? Most importantly, they do care a lot about what they're paying for. And it turns out it's a lot cheaper to have harsh justice than it is to have high certainty of punishment. And so that's our broad explanation for the low certainty of punishment up until the 60s and 70s. So what changed in the 60s and 70s actually is that America actually converged to first world norms in that last category, in the certainty of punishment. And it did so for two reasons. It did so because for the first time, policing was expanded and modernized, partly because the federal government started paying attention to policing. And so Johnson started funneling money into the police. Under Nixon, that expanded as well. There was a lot of police modernization, reform, rooting out some of the traditional forms of corruption in local police. So on the one hand, the police became more efficient at surveilling the population in their brutal ways that they do. And at the same time, the courts also were reformed in ways that gave more power to prosecutors when it came to their leverage over defendants, particularly in plea bargaining. That was a political decision. It was a political decision because these were reforms made mostly by local municipal governments and state governments to some extent. So it's like the arrest rate, the conviction rate, and the rate at which convicted prisoners were sentenced to prison. Those are all the things that increased in the 60s and 70s. And so in some ways, it's the opposite of the conventional story.
So there's so many questions I have for you, but given that we've gotten already into punishment, we'll go back to crime in a second.
Sure.
You tell us that the exceptional punishment rate is related to the exceptionally low social services that the United States government provides. So you're telling us a story of the relation between welfare of the people, for people, and versus punishment as a solution to crime. So can you elaborate a little bit on this and tell us also how is working class unity or segmentation related to this potential choice between where the resources of the state are actually put, whether on welfare or whether in punishment?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that is exactly the right way to put it. It's penal policy and welfare policy. Those are the two levers that the states have to address crime. And in my view, those are the only two levers the states have to address crime, right? You'll see a lot of like snake oil salesmen in the criminology literature telling you that there's like one cheap fix to the problem of crime, but there isn't, right? You either give people reasons to obey the law because they have better incomes in workplaces, or they have better social safety nets that give them good alternatives to crime, or you make the punishment of crime worse and worse and worse, and more highly likely to lead to incarceration. Penal policy and social policy are all there is in the policy field in real terms, if you want to be serious, and they aren't necessarily trade-offs, right? I mean, some states like Singapore does both, right? It does harsh penal policy and generous social policy, right? But the US has all these blocks to social policy, and they're blocks at the level of government at every level. They're blocks that are rooted in the power of American elites and the weakness of the American labor movement. And all of those things are inextricably linked to the importance of slavery in American history, both in its influence on the divided working class, the racial divisions in the working class, and on its influence over the American state. So, the US has the richest capitalist class in the world and the weakest welfare state in the rich world. And as a result, it has a high crime rate, I would argue. And as a result, penal policy is the only tool that the American state really uses to address crime, right? There were ideas in the 60s, right, under Johnson, precisely if you read the Kerner Commission reports and other key policy proposals in the 60s, there was an idea that the American state would wage a war on crime as a war on poverty. But it didn't. It was a stillborn effort, and it was a stillborn effort because the American federal system, the distribution of power within the American federal system, is such that taxing the wealthy and redistributing wealth from rich people in rich places to poor people in poor places is stymied at every single step of the policy process. It's interesting. This is as a side note. Up until the 60s, crime was ignored by the federal government. The federal government saw crime policy as an entirely local matter. By the 60s, partly because of the New Deal and the Civil Rights Revolution, and partly because of the way that the state had become modernized, there was pressure on the federal government to do something about crime. But because these impediments to redistribution remained, all of that pressure, just like in DC, just like in Foreman's case of DC, we see all that popular pressure to do something about rising crime, which was real, be directed into punitive solutions, which were always going to be the fiscally optimal solutions from the point of view of minimizing the burden on the tax payments of the wealthy. And that, I think, is the kind of the one-line story of harshness of American punishment. American punishment is harsh because alternative ways of addressing the real problem of crime are taken off the table.
So tell us why this is, because you tell a very interesting story of how the American working class was weaker than other historical instances, and again, how this is connected to slavery. So can you elaborate a little bit on this, especially on like what happened in terms of like the lack of integration in the urban settings in the 50s and 60s, and the whole, how this supposed golden age of capitalism, this economic growth that the United States was the leader of in those years, was not something that actually people benefited from. And in fact, the marginalization that is in your view the root cause of crime itself. I think you say something very important in your work. You say capitalism breeds crime. So once more, we have a sense of crime that is very much focused on individual misbehavior, and so like moralizing attitudes towards crime. But your structural analysis tells us actually, crime is a feature of a capitalist economy that suppresses the workers into making them excessively poor and marginalized. So I'm very curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on why was this American working class weakened by this processes of exclusion from the supposed pie that was growing?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I mean, and I'm a historian, so I'm always going to be like leaning back in time in my explanation for these things. So I will try to get to the 60s, but I do think that it's important to see the deep roots of the American weakness of the American working class politically. And it's important because it's a political weakness, both because the racial divisions in the working class make working class organization difficult, and because the American state is politically structured in the way it is. So we have to have a story about the American state in always in mind when we talk about that, the way that racism plays out at the level of racial divisions in the working class. So the American state was built by slave owners. The Constitution was written by slave owners who were interested in limiting the power of ordinary people to challenge their power, right? And so Southern slave owners were particularly interested in the danger of Northern free workers gaining hold of the federal government and passing legislation that would in some ways undermine their property rights in human beings. Okay, so that meant one thing that they absolutely needed to do was to limit the taxing capacity of the federal government, and they did that very effectively. Right, the U.S. I think is the only country in history that has had to pass a constitutional amendment to have an income tax. Right, the Constitution was structured to prevent having an income tax, and so there's the kind of fiscal limits that they placed at the level of the federal government, which is, again, the only level of government that can actually do real redistribution from rich people in rich places to poor. At the same time, they kept the power of law in their own hands, precisely because a national law enforcement system could, again, potentially be swayed by popular democratic pressures to challenge their rights to own and control labor. And so the nature of American fragmented law enforcement, so the fact that policing is an entirely local service, again, the US is the only country in the world, as far as I'm aware, that doesn't have any serious federal policing. I mean, Trump is trying to do something like that, but it's still like ICE is smaller than NYPD, right? I mean, there's no comparison. The fragmented nature of law enforcement is such that it provides local elites with law enforcement that's beholden to them, right? Not to voters who could potentially threaten their power. So there's a kind of way in which the sort of the high point of the American economy, the federal government, is constrained from doing anything like social policy, and then the kinds of policies that matter to elites, particularly to their sustaining their local power, is retained at the local level, and that's a through line of American history, right? It's true today. We have a constitutional amendment that allows for an income tax, but that's it, right? Like, you want to introduce a wealth tax in America, like the Constitution is going to prevent you, right? You want to introduce anything that is like, like the New Deal, the entire regulatory basis of the New Deal was threaded through a tiny commerce clause in the Constitution that allowed for the federal government to control interstate trade, right? And that was by design. The Constitution was designed to limit capacity of regulation, of redistribution throughout American history. So that's the first point, right? That the state is not your friend in the US. And the American labor movement knows that, and has always known that, right? The American labor movement, uniquely among labor movements, has never trusted the government, right? And for good reason, right? At the same time, the consequence of the abolition of slavery in 1865, or the end of slavery in 1865, was that now northern employers could turn to the South to provide themselves with a new labor force that could be used in context of strikes to pit white northern workers against them, right? So that the one hugely important dimension of a labor oppressive agriculture under Jim Crow throughout the era of Jim Crow from 1865 to 1945 was that labor in the North was continually pitted against the prospect of competition from repressed and poor, exceptionally exploited labor in the South. And that's a deep problem. So there were all manner of attempts to solve that problem, and it's important to emphasize that the populists and the various attempts of the Knights of Labor to unite across racial lines, right? There were valiant attempts to overcome racial divisions throughout American history within the American labor movement, but they were never successful. And we have to face that fact that they were never successful. And I think that the structural conditions are the best explanation for that, right? I think we can't simply, relitigate every particular strike wave, every particular labor movement and ask where the mistake was made. There was something leading them to make mistakes, right, throughout that history, right? Right up until Operation Dixie with the CIO failing to organize the South, right? That even at its peak, the American labor movement abandoned the prospect of a truly interracial labor movement. And that's a tragedy, no question. It's absolute tragedy. It's a tragedy, though, that has had massive ramifications for the weakness of American labor in a time of crisis, such as the 70s. So yeah, the 60s were a period of expanded opportunity to some extent. At least the 50s was a period of growth, and the 60s was sort of declining slightly, but carried on with that potential for industrial expansion. But when the crisis hit in the 70s, the same racial divisions in the labor movement that had prevented the establishment of something like a Labor Party, for instance, came back to haunt them, especially when it came to municipal politics, right? So the story of white flight is very well known, but there's also a story of black flight in the 60s, because the 60s are a period in which inner cities are being abandoned, both fiscally, because the tax money is being drawn out to the suburbs, and demographically, and the crisis of crime is just one dimension of a broad urban crisis in that period.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you look at I've been looking at the Council of Economic Advisors discussing unemployment in the 60s. And really they say it like the American dream was never able and could not, for the real political limits of our system, bring unemployment below 4% so as to integrate actually the poor in the especially in the urban areas. So this incapacity and unwillingness to actually go beyond what was possible in terms of the scale of inflation also, and actually integrate people within the capitalist economy. So the question is, this capitalist economy was not able to integrate the most vulnerable. And so clearly it bred crime because of its incapacity to integrate. And again, an incapacity that was, of course, because the elite were not interested in social redistribution, but also incapacity because of this clear limit of what do we do if our balance of trade and if our inflation skyrockets, right? So what were the limits of what the stabilizing policy of the Keynesian era in those moments really kind of, I think, are part of the reason here in which we can see that crime is bred out of this type of political economy that is not able to cater to the needs of its population, especially to a population that has been exploited historically much more than the white counterpart.
Absolutely. So I mean, in this book we look at the 60s in a new way. So that it's difficult to understand the 60s as a period of prosperity. But if you look at the bottom of the labor market, if you look at people without a college education, particularly black men without a college education, unemployment rates are rising in the 60s.
Yes. In
this period, that's supposedly the period of greatest prosperity, especially in the South, it's often seen as this kind of moment of true realization of the civil rights dream, which it did. You saw enfranchisement, you saw political wins in the South. But the economic wins were not there really when it came to the poorest of the poor. In fact, their situation is worsening, and so that's the kind of background. Deindustrialization is the kind of broader social capitalist dynamic that is driving a lot of this in the 60s and 70s. But it's in a context where a weak and divided labor movement is incapable really of addressing this in a way that would be necessary through the kinds of redistributive regulatory mechanisms.
Because as we know, any welfare reform, any non-austerity reform derives from pressure from below. So the story you're telling us here is that this pressure in the United States was never strong enough to actually tilt the decision-making of the elite from punishment towards welfare. How do we address the harshness of the punitive state that just victimizes the most vulnerable in a way that you think could learn from the structural lessons that you see in history? And what can people do to resolve the issue in a deeper way than we normally think we can?
So this is great. I mean, every time I think about this, I'm unfortunately, I feel myself as too much of a pessimist, and I want to say more hopeful things. But the truth is, I'm not hopeful. I'm not hopeful because, again, I understand the situation we're in. I understand mass incarceration as a deeply rooted feature of American structural inequalities. So I don't see those deeply rooted structural inequalities being easily transcended today. I see signs of hope. I see potentials, but I'm quite pessimistic. And not only that, I think many other countries are going in the same direction, right? So I'm assuming that actually that for the world as a whole, this kind of policy, mass incarceration story is probably in the future, right? So I'm deeply pessimistic in that sense. It's not just pessimistic about the US, I'm pessimistic about the world. And yet, I think it's necessary to to identify what it would take. And that's partly, for me, about recognizing the limits of certain proposals. So right now, if you, like recently in the New York Times, there was a big article about how the solution to mass incarceration is cognitive behavioral therapy. And, this is like Chicago economists who are like extremely well liked and so, they have a lot of evidence, right, that they can run these CBT experiments. But I've got nothing against giving people mental health care. I think people should have a right to mental health care, whether it's CBT or something else. I think people should have a right to therapy. But the key point to these kind of policy proposals is always that we don't have to do the hard work of addressing inequality, right? And it's because I think they have a faulty understanding of crime, right? They think of crime as some kind of irrationality, some kind of deviant pathology that can be just fixed by a therapist, But that's not what crime is. Crime is people behaving in ways that are responding to the constraints that they're faced. That people like us thinking about their interests and in a difficult situation, and so it's not about the fixing your brain. It's about fixing that situation, and this is why even I think very worthwhile and really interesting solutions like restorative justice, which I think are absolutely necessary, right? Both as a kind of measure to address real problems right now when we don't have the time or we don't have the capacity to win the ultimate goals, and in terms of just experimenting to figure out how to best hold each other accountable. These are necessary measures, and yet they also, I think, stuck in this, well, they can be stuck in this problem that they are like the cheap fix that doesn't really hold accountable the people that we need to hold accountable, right? The wealthy, right? To kind of, Ruthie Gilmore has this great story of, I think that's very compatible with the one that I'm just describing of the 70s as this period of what she calls organized abandonment. So organized abandonment is just, the withdrawal of the welfare state, really, the withdrawal of the social safety nets, but they were already meager in the first place. So it's a withdrawal of a virtually non-existent welfare state. But I think the issue with a lot of progressive reformers is that they are working within that context, assuming that we're going to stay abandoned, and they ask, how do we self-manage our abandonment, basically, which is necessary. I think if you can't do anything else, it's necessary. But we should think bigger than that. Yeah. And one of the things that we should think about is how to stitch together a real alternative, not to punishment in the sense of better forms of punishment, but to giving people better opportunities, such that the kinds of harm that we're trying to mediate and resolve through restorative justice don't happen in the first place. And I think many abolitionists are thinking about that too. So this is not my, I'm not out on a limb here, right? But I think that what that requires, what challenging the fundamental structural inequalities of both the American state and the American political economy, what it requires is something like a broad-based mass movement, right? It doesn't happen at the policy level, really. It doesn't happen at the level of policy innovators finding the technical solution. It happens at the level of building solidarity in the workplace, in the neighborhoods, and yeah, that is in itself, I think, can help in the short term, but in the long term, it can help as a way of providing people with a real security, a real safety.
So in a way, challenging the rule of capital, and crucially, not just about challenging where the resources, challenging where the state, the capitalist state, puts the resources. so more to welfare and less to punishment, but also challenging the deeper issue about exploitation, right? Because if we're talking here about the fact that capital requires people to be subject to the extraction of value from them, we see that the primary thing the capitalist state has to do is protect the expectations of private investors into being able to continue accumulating and exploiting. And this is important because even in the high period of the war against poverty of Lyndon Johnson, there was no ever interest in questioning or challenging private command over investment, right? And this means that there's very little, in fact, that can be imagined as an alternative way of relating to one another that is, in fact, able to abolish crime and abolish punishment, right? Capitalism breeds crime, and it breeds punishment, given that it also breeds the segmentation and the disempowerment of working people, but it also requires the segmentation, the disempowering of people. And this is, I think, the crucial thing. We wouldn't be under capitalism if people were not disempowered, disciplined, and criminalized. So this is, I think, the issue is, could it be fair to say that an abolitionist viewpoint has to consider post-capitalist alternatives to look deeper?
I think this is a great point, and I think that I've been focusing on the American state, right? This uniquely sort of miserly welfare state, and comparing it implicitly to other capitalist states that do provide universal healthcare, universal pre-K and higher education and things like that. And then, so implicitly, I've been sort of suggesting the US has to move, towards this kind of more welfare capitalist model, right? But that presupposes that the welfare capitalist model is sustainable, which I don't think it is under capitalism. I think that what we're seeing, in fact, is the opposite convergence, right? The convergence of the welfare capitalist model in places like Sweden, and the great pinnacles of social democratic fantasy. We're seeing them move in the American direction. Yeah. Precisely now, crime in Sweden is really high. Punishment in Sweden is getting really brutal. And it's precisely the place that we used to look at as the kind of abolitionist dream was Sweden, and we're seeing Sweden converge to the US. And there, I think your point really is where when it comes to crime and welfare becomes really clear, because I think there are really objective limits to the extent to which capitalist states can provide for the working class. In a context where capital flight is a real problem, in a context where capital strikes are really powerful, the political power of capital is not going to bend over. It can be for very exogenous reasons, radically weakened, by a war or something like that. But it's going to come back. Yeah. And then when it comes back, it's going to assert itself precisely in the same way that we see it asserting itself in its extremis in the US case.
Yeah. And there is the point of saying that unless you are capable of maintaining the fundamental economic coercion that is at the foundation of why people even accept to subject themselves to a capitalist production process, you are not able to maintain capitalism alive. Yeah. So this is a conversation that we've been having also with David McNally early on, is that capitalism, like slavery, and he shows, of course, that slavery was capitalist, especially in the United States, is fragile because it presupposes this subordination and the dehumanization of the majority. So the only way in which you're able to maintain this system based on such an unjust economic order is by the coercion of market dependence, which means that if you do have a lot of welfare state, if you do have a lot of rights that are being given to you just by being human and not by being a worker, you're not going to go and sell your capacity to work for a wage. You're not going to accept being bossed around by your boss. You want to say, well, why can't I participate in being fully human and deciding what I'm producing and why? And I think, again, the reason why the Palestinian issue is so interesting is exactly because a lot of workers in the West are refusing to build not just the bomb, but all the technology that is used to repress the populations in the global south, right? And it's because they have no option. They if they refuse, they need to find a different job. So I think this is a really important point, is how much there are political limits to the welfare state, clearly. It's not just about resources. You say it's expensive, but let's say we even find those resources. The point is that those resources depend themselves in being produced from a population that needs to be kept subjugated. And the way you keep a population subjugated is to make sure that they don't have enough to survive without going to work for a wage. So this whole idea that we can have capitalism with welfare state and these two are like compatible institutions, I think is a deep problem that the left needs to take much more seriously, right? Because it is, in fact, the precariousness and the fact that austerity, as I try to show, is in the DNA of the system, clearly is like the political foundation to what is needed for this economy to work in the first place. And thus, in a way, punishment is just, and this obscene level of punishment is the most obvious political consequence of this very political system that requires exploitation in the first place somehow. What do you think?
I think exactly that. I mean, I think the austerity is in the DNA. I mean, another way of saying that is the insecurity of the working class is in the DNA of the system, right? Insecurity of the working class benefits employers. Not just benefits them, it's the condition for that employment relation to survive, right? Workers have to be sufficiently insecure,
right,
that they need the security of the employer, right?
Yes.
In the US, that takes the extreme form that the employer provides healthcare, right?
Exactly.
And like, so if you want the security of your health, you need to beg an employer for that health, right? But in that occurs at every level of working class insecurity, including crime. You know, crime is a feature of working class insecurity. It's a feature of wage dependency in that sense, right? In a context where you are abandoned, should you, to your own devices, should you not be employed, right? In a context where the employer has the leverage over you. The employer can fire you and threaten you with losing everything.
Yes.
By firing you, they're threatening your healthcare, they're threatening your life, that you are potentially subject to violence at an interpersonal level, but also the level of the state, because the punishment of the state and the policing is part and parcel of the twin forms of violence, really, that poor and marginalized people face on a daily basis. The violence of crime and the violence of the state. That's all part and parcel of a generalized insecurity that is a condition for the entire system of surplus value extraction to work.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there are marginal inroads that you can have that limit that insecurity, and those are necessary to fight for and win, partly because they are the necessary condition for a successful labor movement. But they are not going to ever eliminate that without eliminating that capitalist relation in the first place.
Completely. And that's why it's so important that we de-fetishize the economy by saying that this economy is based on these fragile political balances that are all about class relations. And in order to move anything in the society, we need to rethink and challenge this very class relation. So I think your whole point of saying the solution can't be just a technical fix, but it has to be about confronting the entrenched power of the wealthy, is a lesson. And yes, we are in dark times, but I think it is these type of conversations that allow people that are also organizing in this world of restorative justice to have the wider picture in mind. Because if you start by asking for greater welfare, this could escalate to actually asking to break away from the trap of economic coercion that is foundational to capitalism in the first place, right? So I think, I hope that these conversations offer at least a form of conceptual empowerment in saying, we know we are trapped, but we understand why we're trapped. And so we also understand that restorative justice is for example, a very important concrete experimentation of the power of us re-socializing in a different way. But in the same time, we need to be able to confront the capitalist state to try to really push against the whole political foundation that is the grounding feature of our economy. Thank you, John, for being with us here. I've learned so much from your work, and I can't wait to see the final version of the book.
Thank you.
Coming up. We will have you back maybe when the book is out. And I hope you can see Tulsa with less rain next time you visit us.
I'm looking forward to coming back.
Thank you.
Thank you.